there are those moments in life where we make decisions that impact the course and direction of the rest of our lives. And for me, two of those were the moments where, as a young preteen at the age of 10, and then as a young adult at the age of 19, I committed my life to following after Jesus. To not just believing in religious doctrine and having theological head knowledge, but to actually following it with the rest of my life. And that's a very important distinction, because over 70% of people in America claim to be Christians. But all it takes is a quick look on the TV channels and the news, and look at how the people in our own communities treat each other, and we can quickly see that Christian values and principles are not part of the daily lives and cultures of the people around us. The Barna research group actually found out that only 1 in 7 people who claim to be Christian actually integrate the Christian teachings into their lives. Why is this? Because you see, there's a difference between converts and disciples. Converts change their mind, but disciples change their lives. And it's interesting that Jesus did not command his disciples to go into the world and make converts. He called them to go into the world and make disciples. And you see, there's a radical difference. The majority of people in our country believe and accept the philosophies of the Christian faith, even if they wouldn't say they're a Christian. They love the things like don't steal, don't murder, love your neighbor, right? A person that's a human being is a person of value. Those kind of common things that we just kind of accept are part of the Christian worldview and philosophy. But very few people are actually disciples of Jesus. And Jesus, when he called his disciples, he didn't call them to come be with him for a week or two and then go back to their daily life. He said, come and follow me. And Jesus, being the radical rabbi that he was, didn't choose just the best and brightest of the Torah schools like a normal rabbi would. Traditionally, like the Apostle Paul was chosen by the Rabbi Gamaliel, that the best and brightest of the Torah schools would be selected by a rabbi, and that person would follow them until they hit age 30, and then they would become a rabbi in their own right. But Jesus called the most unlikely of people, fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, even women, which would have been scandalous at the time. Jesus was radical, and I love that. But when we look at this idea of converts versus disciples, you and I have to decide, which are we? And as we start a new set of lessons together, I want to look at the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount opens with a very interesting part of the passage where it says that Jesus gathered his disciples together and he taught them. That for some reason in my mind, I always had this idea of thousands upon thousands of people coming and sitting down to hear the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus did have more than 12 disciples. We think about the 12, but Jesus had at one point hundreds of disciples. But these were not just people who had just showed up, even though that was probably possible. Jesus was specifically teaching the Sermon on the Mount to his disciples. And so that means if you and I commit to being his disciples, that means that it applies to you and I as well. So what you have to decide, and what I have to decide, is, are we converts? Are we disciples? Converts change their minds. They have a head knowledge, a belief, but disciples change their lives. And we have to decide that. Are we going to change just the way we think about things, or are we going to actually change the way we live? And there's a reason why the church across the world is losing its impact, why the light that shines in the darkness is growing dimmer in our lives. Not that the light of Jesus is dimming, by no means, because the promise of Scripture is that the darkness can never overcome it. But we have done what Jesus told us not to do. We'll look at that in the Sermon on the Mount. We've covered our light, and it's grown dim because we have head knowledge, but we don't actually change our lives. And there's this beautiful poetic passage in the Mishnah that actually says, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. You see, Jesus was a rabbi who called his disciples. And the idea of that passage from the Mishnah was that you would be so close as a disciple to your rabbi that you walked in their footsteps so closely that the dust that they kicked up off the road, and as they walked through the desert to go from town to town, that wherever the rabbi was, you were so close to them that they kicked up dust and it covered you because you were following in their footsteps. What does that mean for you and me? Well, if we're disciples of Jesus, that means that the way we act is the way Jesus would act. That when people hear us speak, that they hear the way Jesus would speak. That when we interact with each other and the way we treat our neighbor is the way Jesus interacted with and treated his neighbor. And the way we even treat our enemies is the way Jesus treated his enemies. So I want to encourage you and ask you to do a little heart check today and ask, are you a convert? Am I a convert? Or are we disciples? And as we start to look at this series of the Sermon on the Mount, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. And thank God that our rabbi is more than just a human teacher. That yes, disciples are imitators of their teachers, but Jesus is more than a rabbi, more than a prophet, more than a miracle worker. He is God. So are you a convert or are you a disciple? May we be disciples that imitate our teacher and are covered in the dust of our rabbi. Have a blessed day.